Alexander Hayes never believed in family secrets. For 15 years he had lived in Philadelphia, teaching classical literature to the sons and daughters of merchants and lawyers. Latin verbs, Greek myths, Roman history, clean subjects, safe subjects, far away from the Virginia plantation that carried his family name, far away from the past. He believed that whatever darkness had existed in his family had died with the old generation, buried in the soil of the South along with slavery and war. He was wrong. On September 3, 1868, a telegram arrived at his boarding house. It was short, cold, official. Thomas Hayes deceased September 1. Heart failure. As sole heir your presence required to settle estate. No words of comfort, no details, just a demand. Alexander felt something then, not grief, something colder, a quiet certainty that the past he had avoided for so long had finally found him. 3 weeks later he was kneeling on the dusty floor of his uncle's study at Willowbrook plantation. His hands shook as he pried up a loose floorboard. Beneath it lay a leather-bound journal. Old, cracked, heavy with age. That book would destroy everything he thought he knew about his family. About education, about slavery, and about what had happened at Willowbrook 40 years earlier. Before we uncover what was hidden inside that journal, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and tell us in the comments if you have ever discovered a family secret that changed how you saw your own history. Now let us go back to the beginning. The journey from Philadelphia to Virginia took 3 days. Train, coach, dust, heat. Each mile pulled Alexander deeper into memories he had spent years trying to forget. Virginia in September was thick with summer. Tobacco fields stretched endlessly under a pale sky. The land looked peaceful, almost gentle, but Alexander knew better. Every field had been worked by enslaved hands. Every beautiful view was built on suffering. As the coach rolled forward he remembered childhood summers spent here, running barefoot through the fields, laughing, never questioning who made that life possible. He had left in 1853 at 17 years old. He never looked back. His father had died when Alexander was 7. His mother remarried and moved north. His uncle Thomas stayed behind and ran the plantation alone for 25 years. They wrote polite letters. Weather, health, nothing meaningful. Alexander preferred it that way. Fairhaven was a small Virginia town that seemed frozen in time. The war had passed through it and left scars. Buildings were worn, streets quiet, the future uncertain. The law office of Josiah Vance sat near the courthouse. It was neat, orderly, almost too clean for a place surrounded by decay. Vance was a small man with silver hair and careful eyes. Mr. Hayes, thank you for coming. They shook hands. The estate is simple, Vance said. 400 acres. The house, outbuildings, no debts. He paused before continuing. The land is not worth what it once was. Without the old labor system most plantations here have failed. I do not plan to farm it, Alexander replied. I will inspect the property and decide what to do. Vance nodded. Your uncle was an unusual man. Brilliant, quiet, reclusive. He lived alone after the war. Kept no servants. Rarely came to town. He spent most of his time reading and writing. Latin and Greek. He went to Harvard, Alexander said. Yes, class of 1820. There was something Vance did not say. Alexander could feel it, but the man only handed him the keys. A local boy drove Alexander to Willowbrook that afternoon. The plantation appeared slowly over the hills. First the roof, then the columns, then the full stretch of land. Fields abandoned, slave quarters collapsing, roofs caved in, windows broken. The land felt empty in a way that went deeper than neglect. Like something had been taken from it. The boy unloaded the trunk and hesitated before leaving. They say the place is haunted, sir. Say old Mr. Hayes never slept peaceful. Alexander said nothing. The front door stood unlocked. Inside the house dust floated in the light. Everything was arranged perfectly but untouched. Covered, preserved, like time had stopped decades ago. Furniture from his grandfather's era. Heavy, dark, severe. The library was overwhelming. Shelves packed from floor to ceiling. Books everywhere. Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Virgil, Greek plays, Roman histories. This was not a planter's collection. This was a scholar's life work. Upstairs the bedrooms were bare. His uncle's room was almost monk-like. A narrow bed, one chair, no decoration, but the study at the end of the hall was different. The desk was buried in papers, letters, manuscripts, translations written in neat careful handwriting. A single armchair sat by the window. This room had been lived in, struggled in, suffered in. That night Alexander could not sleep. On his second day in the house he returned to the study. While moving the desk he noticed a loose floorboard. It came up easily. The journal lay beneath it. The first page listed 73 names. Each name followed by something impossible. Grammar exercises, Latin conjugations, translations of Virgil, Cicero, Horace. 73 enslaved people, secretly taught Latin between 1821 and 1828. Alexander's breath caught. Teaching enslaved people to read was illegal. Teaching them classical languages was unthinkable. Then he reached the final entry. Dated April 17, 1828. The writing stopped mid-sentence. Ink spilled across the page as if the writer's hand had been suddenly torn away. Whatever happened that spring ended everything. No one spoke of it again. Until now. In the next part we will uncover who those 73 names belong to and why teaching them Latin led to something so terrible it was buried for 40 years. If this story has pulled you in, subscribe, share this video, and tell us in the comments what you think happened at Willowbrook Plantation. The past is not finished with us yet. Part 2. Lessons in the Dark. What Alexander Hayes read next made his skin crawl. Not because it was cruel. Not because it was violent. But because it was dangerous in a way that history rarely admits. Before you go further into this buried truth, subscribe to the channel, share this story with someone who loves hidden history, and tell us in the comments if you believe knowledge itself can be an act of rebellion. Now let us return to the journal. Alexander sat alone in his uncle's study as the morning light climbed the walls. Dust drifted through the air. The house was silent, but in his hands, the journal felt alive. The next pages described the lessons in careful detail. The tobacco barn became their classroom. After dark, one candle. The door barred from inside. Voices kept low. Lookouts posted near the fields. Thomas Hayes wrote of fear constantly. Not fear for himself, but fear for his students. Every sound outside the barn. Every snapping twig. Every distant shout sent his heart racing. Yet the lessons continued. By April of 1821, attendance had grown from 17 to 30. Men and women, young and old, field hands, house servants, skilled workers. Some had never held a book before. Some barely knew their letters. Others learned with shocking speed. Thomas described Diana reciting Virgil from memory after hearing it once. Marcus correcting another student's grammar. Benjamin staying late to practice. Declensions by candlelight even when his hands bled from blacksmith work. Alexander felt a strange tightness in his chest as he read. These were not passive victims. These were minds starved and suddenly fed. The journal made clear that Thomas was not simply teaching language. He was building something. By 1822, the lessons expanded. They moved beyond grammar into translation. Then into discussion. What does Virgil mean by fate? What does Seneca say about virtue? Can a man be morally good while obeying an unjust law? Alexander paused on that line. Even reading it in 1868 felt dangerous. Thomas wrote that the discussions were careful. Always indirect. Always framed as ancient questions. But everyone understood the parallels. They spoke of Roman slavery. Of masters and freedmen, of laws that claimed divine authority, of men who questioned those laws and paid the price. The students understood immediately. Thomas noted with amazement how quickly they grasped abstract ideas. They did not need to be told that Rome was Virginia. That chains came in many forms. That history repeated itself. By 1823, the group numbered over 50. That was when the first warning appeared. One night, a dog barked near the barn. A lantern passed close enough that light slipped through the cracks in the boards. The students froze. Breathing stopped. Hearts hammered. But the overseer moved on. Thomas wrote that after that night, some students stopped coming. Too afraid. Too much to lose. Others came anyway. Fear did not drive them away. It sharpened them. Then came the incident Thomas referred to only as the accident. A young boy named Elijah. 12 years old. Son of a field worker. Too young to attend lessons. Too curious to stay away. Elijah followed his mother one night and listened from outside the barn. He learned Latin words without understanding what they were. He repeated them at home. Innocently. The next day, another child mocked him for speaking nonsense. An overseer heard. The boy was questioned. Harshly. Elijah never named names. But suspicion spread. Thomas wrote that punishment followed anyway. Not public. Quiet. Severe. Elijah was sent away to another plantation. Alexander felt sick. The journal recorded Thomas's guilt in brutal detail. He considered ending the lessons then. Burning the books. Destroying the evidence. But the students begged him not to. Marcus told him that even if it ended tomorrow, what they had learned could never be taken away. They had tasted something forbidden. The lessons continued. By 1825, the group had divided into levels. Beginners. Advanced. A small inner circle who could read full passages of Cicero without help. That was when Thomas began the most dangerous step. Writing. He taught them to write Latin. Not English. Not names. Latin. A language no overseer would recognize. A written code hidden in plain sight. They copied texts onto scraps of paper. Practiced secretly. Destroyed evidence carefully. Thomas wrote that it was the proudest moment of his life when Marcus wrote a full paragraph in Latin describing his own thoughts. A man legally considered property expressing philosophy in the language of Rome. But pride was followed by dread. Rumors began circulating. Whispers among white neighbors. Talk of strange behavior. Educated slaves. Unusual discipline. One planter joked that Thomas was running a monastery instead of a plantation. Another was not joking. In 1827, a neighboring estate experienced a small rebellion. It was crushed quickly, brutally, though there was no connection to Willowbrook. Fear swept the county. Night patrols increased. Searches became common. Any hint of literacy was punished. Thomas wrote that he knew their time was running out. Still, he could not stop. The final entries grew darker. He wrote of arguments among the students. Fear versus hope. Survival versus truth. Some wanted to flee. Some wanted to spread the knowledge further. Some wanted to wait. Thomas tried to restrain them. He insisted the lessons were about the mind, not action. But ideas once planted do not remain still. The last complete entry was dated April 17, 1828. It described a lesson on Roman law. The concept of natural rights. The idea that no human law can erase human dignity. Thomas wrote that as he spoke, he saw something change in the room. Not excitement. Resolve. Then the writing stopped. Ink spilled across the page. As if the pen had been knocked from his hand. Alexander closed the journal slowly. Outside, the house creaked as if responding. Whatever happened that night was not recorded. But it ended everything. The lessons. The secrecy. The silence that lasted 40 years. In the next part, Alexander will discover why no one ever spoke of April 18, 1828 and why Willowbrook was abandoned long before the war ever came. If this story has gripped you, subscribe to the channel, share this video, and tell us in the comments what you think happened in that tobacco barn when the lessons finally went too far. History is watching. Part 3. The experiment that refused to die. What Alexander Hayes was reading was no longer just history. It was proof of something America had tried very hard to forget. Before we go deeper into this story, take a moment to subscribe, share this video, and tell us in the comments whether you believe ideas can survive even the most brutal systems designed to destroy them. Now let us return to the journal. The entries were scattered across months and years, sometimes written weekly, sometimes after long silences. But together they told a single story. Thomas Hayes called it the experiment. Not an experiment in cruelty. An experiment in truth. A young scholar fresh from Harvard had decided to test a forbidden idea. That enslaved people were not intellectually inferior. That the lie holding slavery together could be shattered by education alone. April 1821. Thomas wrote of progress. Of grammar mastered. Of minds opening. Diana grasped syntax as if she had always known it. Marcus built knowledge patiently, one rule at a time. Benjamin struggled, failed, returned, and refused to quit. By May there were 32 students. The lessons expanded beyond grammar into history. Caesar, Rome, power, conquest. And then came the question that haunted Alexander long after he read it. What does it mean to cross a point of no return? Thomas realized in that moment that something irreversible was happening. The lessons were no longer about Latin. They were about choice. About agency. About deciding who you are even when the world denies it. June brought suspicion. Thomas's father noticed changes. Posture. Speech. Confidence. Nothing visible. Nothing provable. But something undeniable. The lessons moved constantly. Barns. Woods. The house basement. Always adapting. Always hiding. July. 57 students. The knowledge spread faster than Thomas could control. Students taught each other, met in secret, practiced translations on stolen scraps of paper. The learning no longer depended on him. That realization both thrilled and terrified him. August brought Seneca, anger, power, hypocrisy. Marcus pointed out that Seneca preached virtue while serving a tyrant. Alexander felt a chill reading Thomas's words. That question still had no answer. It still does. The journal moved into 1822 with increasing tension. Pride and fear braided together on every page. Then came 1823, the year everything almost ended. Thomas sensed it before it happened. His father watching from the window. The deliberate questions at breakfast. The careful pauses. The lie about the sick horse. The suspension of lessons. Too late. Marcus was caught. Reading Ovid. A book meant to free the mind became evidence of guilt. Alexander's stomach turned as he read what followed. The confrontation. The lie. The forced watching. 20 lashes. Marcus made no sound. That silence was louder than any scream. Thomas wrote that he saw understanding in Marcus's eyes. Not blame. Acceptance. This is the cost. Alexander had to stop reading then. He stood in the study shaking, staring at shelves of books that had once been weapons. The journal resumed days later. Thomas wanted to end it all. Burn the books. Destroy the evidence. Protect whoever he could. Then Diana came. She spoke for all of them. They wanted to continue. They knew the risks better than he ever could. Violence was familiar. Ignorance was worse. Knowledge lived where whips could not reach. That sentence burned itself into Alexander's mind. The lessons resumed. Smaller. Quieter. Deeper in the woods. Something had changed. This was no longer hope. This was defiance. The students understood now that this knowledge might cost them everything. And still they came. Through 1823. Through 1824. Through 1825. Alexander read of debates that would shame universities. Tacitus. Tyranny. Complicity. Benjamin asked whether slavery would someday be remembered as Rome's worst crimes were remembered. Thomas said yes. Marcus said he would not live to see it. That line broke something in Alexander. March 1825. 73 students. The experiment had reached its limit. Some could read Latin fluently. They debated leadership, power, history. These conversations happened under trees. In darkness. In silence. People considered property, discussed the fate of empires. July 1825 brought the most dangerous question of all. Why never discuss escape? Thomas realized his own fear. Fear of rebellion. Fear of blame. Diana's answer stripped it away. They already knew how to run. What they wanted was proof. Proof that slavery was built on lies. Proof that their minds were free even if their bodies were not. Alexander closed the journal and pressed his palms against the desk. Everything he had been taught about slavery was wrong. The lie was not that enslaved people could not think. The lie was that they should not. And someone at Willowbrook had tried to undo that lie. In the next part, we will see how this experiment began to attract attention beyond Willowbrook and why April 1828 ended in silence, blood, and disappearance. If this story has shaken you, subscribe to the channel, share it with others, and tell us in the comments what you think finally stopped the experiment. Because knowledge, once awakened, does not die quietly. Part 4. The year the silence began. There is a moment in every hidden crime when silence stops being protection and becomes a warning. Alexander Hayes felt that moment coming as he turned the next page of the journal. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel, share this story with someone who loves forgotten history, and tell us in the comments if you believe silence can be more terrifying than violence. Now let us return to Willowbrook. By the end of 1825, Thomas Hayes knew the experiment had gone too far to be undone. 73 students. 4 years of secret learning. Minds permanently changed. The journal entries from late 1825 grew shorter. Tighter. Less reflective. Fear had replaced curiosity. Thomas wrote that neighbors had begun asking questions. Too many enslaved people speaking carefully. Too many asking to be excused from evening work at the same time. Too many subtle signs that something unusual was happening. Nothing illegal could be proven. But suspicion does not need proof. In January 1826, Thomas noted that patrols were increasing. White men riding the roads at night. Lanterns swinging. Dogs trained to track movement through the woods. The lessons continued anyway. They always did. Marcus argued that stopping now would be worse than being caught. Knowledge half learned was still knowledge. But abandoning it would break something inside them. Diana agreed. If they lived the rest of their lives pretending they had never tasted freedom of thought, the loss would hollow them out. Thomas wrote that he admired their courage and feared it. February 1826 brought a new danger. A man named Caleb Porter arrived at a neighboring plantation. A distant cousin of Thomas's father. Recently ruined. Bitter. Watchful. Porter had lost enslaved people to escape. Others to illness. His plantation was failing. According to the journal, Porter spoke openly of tightening control. Of discipline. Of restoring order. He believed something was wrong in the county. Thomas wrote that Porter's eyes lingered too long on Willowbrook when he visited. That he asked too many questions about behavior. About work done after dark. That same month, a bundle of papers was discovered hidden near the woods. Latin writing. Rough. Fragmented. Practice translations. Thomas never learned who found them. Only that rumors began spreading immediately. Talk of education, of conspiracy, of rebellion disguised as religion. March 1826. The lessons moved deeper into the forest. No candles, no books, everything taught from memory. Thomas marveled at what the students had retained. Entire passages of Virgil recited from memory. Arguments reconstructed without text. The experiment no longer depended on physical proof. That terrified him more than anything else. April 1826 marked the first disappearance. A young man named Samuel. Quiet, brilliant, one of the most advanced students. He failed to appear for a lesson. Then another. Then another. Finally word came that Samuel had been sold south without warning. No explanation. No farewell. Just gone. Thomas wrote that the group sat in silence for a long time that night. No discussion. No lesson. Only the understanding that knowledge made them visible. And visibility was dangerous. Summer brought more losses. 2 women sent to different plantations. A man beaten badly after being accused of insolence. None of the punishments could be directly linked to the lessons. But everyone knew. This was pressure. A warning. Thomas considered stopping again. The students refused. Marcus said something Thomas wrote down carefully. They can take people away, but they cannot take back what already exists in the mind. Stopping now would mean admitting fear had won. So they continued. Carefully, quietly, almost ritualistically, they began referring to the lessons as the remembering. Not learning, remembering, as if this knowledge had always belonged to them. By winter 1826, Thomas's father fell ill. Confined to bed, weak, watchful, Thomas hoped the danger would pass. It did not. In January 1827, Garrett the overseer began attending night patrols personally. Garrett was not curious. He was methodical. He knew how to watch without being seen. Thomas wrote that he felt hunted. February 1827 brought the first direct confrontation. Garrett questioned Diana, not violently, casually, asked why she spoke so carefully now, why she paused before answering, why she sometimes used words that sounded educated. Diana denied everything. Garrett smiled. That smile haunted Thomas's dreams. The journal entries from this period were frantic. Broken sentences, gaps. Thomas knew discovery was no longer a question of if, only when. March 1827. A dog followed Marcus home from the woods. Garrett watched from a distance. No action was taken, just observation, pressure. April 1827. The lessons shrank to a single small group. The most trusted, the most committed. Thomas wrote that he had stopped teaching entirely. Now they simply talked, shared ideas, held on to something that felt like humanity. By the end of 1827, the journal recorded only 1 sentence per month. Still alive, still meeting, still hidden. Then came 1828. The year that ended everything. The entry dated March 29, 1828 was the last calm one. Thomas wrote that something was coming. That the air itself felt charged. That the woods no longer felt safe. The students sensed it too. No one suggested stopping. They all knew stopping would not save them. The final complete entry was dated April 17, 1828. Alexander remembered the ink stain. The torn sentence. That night Thomas wrote they discussed Roman law. Natural rights. The idea that unjust laws have no moral authority. He wrote that he saw resolve on their faces. Not anger. Decision. The next page was blank. Then came the ink spill. No explanation. No record of April 18th. No record of what followed. Only silence. Alexander closed the journal slowly. The house around him creaked as if responding. Whatever happened after that lesson was so catastrophic that it erased itself. No official records. No family stories. No town gossip. Just abandonment. In the next part, Alexander will search Fairhaven for answers and discover that the town remembers Willowbrook far better than anyone admits. If this story has pulled you deeper, subscribe to the channel, share it, and tell us in the comments what you believe happened after that final lesson. Because some silences are not empty. They are full of things no one dares to name. Part 5. The town that remembered too much. Some places do not forget. They simply learn how to stay quiet. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel, share this story with someone who loves hidden history, and tell us in the comments if you believe communities can carry guilt the way people do. Now let us follow Alexander Hayes beyond the walls of Willowbrook. After reading the final legible page of the journal, Alexander could no longer stay inside the house. The silence pressed against him. The dust felt heavy. The walls seemed to listen. He locked the study and rode into Fairhaven before noon. The town looked unchanged from the day he arrived. Same slow pace, same cautious faces, but now Alexander noticed something else. People watched him, not openly, not rudely, but with interest that felt practiced. At the general store, conversation stopped when he entered. It resumed only after he left. At the church steps, two older men paused mid-sentence when they saw him approach. By the time he reached Josiah Vance's office, Alexander understood something important. Fairhaven knew about Willowbrook. Vance greeted him politely, but the lawyer's eyes flicked toward the door as he closed it. "You have questions," Vance said quietly. Alexander nodded. "About my uncle. About what happened here before the war." Vance hesitated, then sighed. "I wondered when you would ask." He gestured to a chair and sat across from Alexander, folding his hands carefully. "Your uncle was respected," Vance said. "Brilliant, strange, and deeply troubling to some." "Troubling how?" Vance leaned back. "There were rumors, education, improper ideas, dangerous sympathy." Alexander felt his pulse quicken. "Were there accusations?" "No formal charges," Vance said. "That would have required evidence. But there was an investigation." "An investigation by whom?" "By the county patrols. By neighboring planters." Quietly. "What did they find?" "Nothing that could be proven in court. But enough to convince certain men that Thomas Hayes was a problem." Alexander asked the question he had been avoiding. "What happened in April 1828? Vance did not answer immediately. Instead he stood and closed the blinds. "People disappeared," he said finally. Alexander felt cold spread through his chest. "How many?" "No one agrees on a number." Vance explained that on the morning of April 18, 1828, several enslaved people failed to report to work at multiple plantations, not just Willowbrook. By noon, patrols were riding. By evening, dogs were brought in. Tracks led into the woods. And then vanished. Some believed there had been an attempted uprising. Others believed there had been an organized escape. No bodies were found. No arrests were made. But punishments followed anyway. Whippings. Sales. Families separated. And your uncle, Thomas Hayes, locked himself in the house. Refused visitors. Refused explanation. Within a year, most of Willowbrook's enslaved population had been sold off. The plantation never recovered. Alexander asked the most important question. "Did anyone ever prove what my uncle was doing?" Vance shook his head, but everyone believed it. They believed he had filled enslaved minds with dangerous ideas. Ideas about equality, about rights, about justice. And ideas, Mr. Hayes, are the hardest things to chain. Alexander left the office with more questions than answers. He spent the afternoon walking Fairhaven. At the old jail, a retired deputy recognized him. "Your uncle taught them to read," the man said bluntly. "Latin," Alexander replied. The deputy stared. "Latin, yes." The man shook his head slowly. "That explains it then." "Explains what?" "Why they were so calm." Alexander stopped. "Calm." The deputy nodded. "When the patrols cornered a small group near the creek that night, no one fought. No one ran. They stood there listening." "Listening to what?" The deputy swallowed. "One of them was speaking. In a language no one recognized." Alexander felt the world tilt. What happened then? Garrett ordered them seized. There was shouting, confusion, and then a gun went off. After that, everything fell apart. Alexander returned to Willowbrook at dusk. The land looked different now. Not empty, alert. He walked the edge of the woods, guided by memory and instinct, until he found the creek. The ground dipped there, sheltered by trees. He saw faint depressions in the soil. Old, almost erased. A clearing, a classroom. Alexander sat on a fallen log as the light faded. He imagined them there. Marcus, Diana, Benjamin, 73 minds alive in the dark. Not plotting violence. Thinking. That was the crime. As night fell, Alexander heard something he could not explain. A murmur. Not voices exactly. More like breath moving through leaves. He stood quickly. The sound stopped. He told himself it was imagination. But as he turned back toward the house, he noticed something near the creek bank. A stone, smooth, deliberately placed. Carved into it were letters. Not English. Latin. He knelt and traced them with trembling fingers. Veritas non occiditur. Truth is not killed. Alexander understood then. Some had escaped. Some had survived. And someone wanted the truth remembered. In the next part, Alexander will uncover who carried that knowledge forward and why Willowbrook was never meant to be silent forever. If this story has haunted you, subscribe to the channel, share it with others, and tell us in the comments what you think really happened to the students of Willowbrook. Because some lessons refuse to stay buried. Part 6. The knowledge that survived. Some truths do not end when the people who carried them disappear. They move, they hide, they wait. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel, share this story with someone who loves forgotten history, and tell us in the comments if you believe ideas can outlive even the people who risked everything to protect them. Now let us return to Willowbrook. Alexander could not forget the stone by the creek. Truth is not killed. The Latin words followed him back to the house like a whisper. He locked the door behind him and sat in the dark parlor, listening to the sounds of the old plantation settling around him. That night he dreamed of voices speaking a language he understood but had never heard spoken aloud. When he woke before dawn, the dream still clung to him. He returned to the study and opened the journal again. He read the final entries once more, searching for anything he had missed. And this time he noticed something new. The handwriting changed. In the last pages, Thomas Hayes was no longer writing only for himself. The tone was careful, directed, almost instructional. Alexander realized with a chill that his uncle had expected discovery. He had planned for failure. One entry dated early April 1828 caught his attention. If this record ends abruptly, know that the work does not end here. Knowledge once shared cannot be gathered back. The seed has scattered. Alexander closed the book slowly. The seed. That meant survivors. The question was how many. He spent the next day searching the house. Behind shelves. Under floorboards. Inside hollow walls. Most of it was empty. Cleaned long ago. Then in the attic he found a box. It was small and wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were scraps of paper. Fragile. Nearly dust. Latin phrases. Names. Dates. Not lessons. Messages. Alexander spread them carefully on the floor. Some were written in different hands. Some were copies of the same phrase written again and again. Mens libera. A free mind. He understood then. This was not a teacher preserving his work. This was a network. That afternoon Alexander returned to Fairhaven with a different purpose. He asked questions no outsider would think to ask. Who had left town suddenly before the war? Which families had moved north without explanation? Who sent children to schools they could not afford? At first people resisted. Then slowly, reluctantly, pieces emerged. A woman who had gone to Baltimore in the 1830s to work as a laundress. Her son became a printer. A man who escaped to Ohio and opened a small school for colored children. A preacher in Pennsylvania who quoted Latin scripture with strange fluency. Alexander followed these threads through letters and church records and faded town accounts. The pattern became clear. Not all 73 had survived. Many were lost, sold, killed, erased, but enough had carried the knowledge forward. They did not start rebellions. They did something quieter. They taught. They taught reading, reasoning, history. They taught children how to think. Alexander found a letter dated 1847 from a schoolteacher in New Jersey. It mentioned a former slave named Marcus who helped translate classical texts for students. Marcus. The name burned. Alexander tracked down the school. It no longer existed, but the town records confirmed it. Marcus had died in 1852. Free, educated, a teacher. Diana appeared in records too. A woman of that name appeared in Boston in 1841. Listed as a lecturer, known for her sharp mind and calm voice. Her lectures were said to leave audiences silent. She quoted ancient philosophers. No one knew where she learned them. Alexander returned to Willowbrook with this knowledge and felt something shift inside him. The plantation was not a grave. It was a beginning, but the horror had not ended in 1828. There was one final truth Alexander had not yet faced. His uncle, Thomas Hayes, never left Willowbrook. He lived another 20 years. Alone, silent. Alexander found town records that revealed the truth. Thomas was never charged, but he was never forgiven. Neighbors shunned him. Scholars stopped writing. Invitations ceased. He became a ghost while still alive. The journal had not recorded his final decision. Alexander found it buried in a ledger at the county office. Thomas had manumitted the remaining enslaved people at Willowbrook in 1829. Quietly, legally, it ruined him financially, but it was the last thing he could do. After that, he lived among empty rooms and unread books. Alexander finally understood the punishment. Thomas Hayes was allowed to live, but never to belong. That night Alexander returned to the creek. He brought a candle and the journal. He read aloud, not loudly, not dramatically. He read the names, one by one, 73. As he spoke them, the night seemed to lean closer. The wind moved through the trees in a way that felt almost responsive. Alexander placed the stone back where he found it and added another beside it. He carved the words himself. Mens libera, a free mind. In the next part, Alexander will face a choice that echoes his uncle's. Whether to reveal the truth and risk destruction or remain silent and let history stay buried. If this story has stayed with you, subscribe to the channel, share it with others, and tell us in the comments what you think Alexander should do next. Because the most dangerous lesson is the one that asks us to act. Part 7. The price of telling the truth. Some knowledge does not ask to be learned. It demands a decision. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel, share this story with someone who believes history still matters, and tell us in the comments if you think the truth should always be revealed no matter the cost. Now let us return to Alexander Hayes. After discovering that the knowledge of Willowbrook had survived, Alexander felt something heavier than fear. Responsibility. He was no longer just a witness. He was a link in a chain that stretched back nearly 50 years. And chains, he knew, could be used to bind or to pull something free. Alexander spent days rereading the journal and letters. He copied passages carefully. He organized names and dates. He began drafting an article in his own hand. Not for a newspaper, for scholars, for universities, for a future that might finally be ready to hear what Willowbrook had been. But the house did not want him to rush. At night strange things began to happen. Books fell from shelves without explanation. Candles guttered though the windows were closed. Once, while reading in the study, Alexander heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow, careful, he called out. No answer. When he checked the hall, it was empty. He told himself it was the house settling. He did not believe it. One night he dreamed of Thomas Hayes standing at the foot of the bed. Not angry, not accusing, watching, as if waiting to see what Alexander would choose. The next morning Alexander rode into Fairhaven carrying copies of his notes. He planned to send them north. He stopped first at the post office. The clerk looked at the address and hesitated. Philadelphia, academic institutions. That is a lot of paper, sir. It is important, Alexander replied. The clerk nodded but his eyes were uneasy. Word travels fast in small towns. By afternoon, Alexander noticed men watching him. Again, this time openly. At the general store, an older planter spoke to him directly. You asking questions about old trouble, the man said. History, Alexander replied. The planter smiled without warmth. Some history is better left quiet. That evening Alexander found a note slipped under the door at Willowbrook. No signature. Leave it buried. He did not sleep that night. The following day Josiah Vance arrived unannounced. The lawyer looked older, tired. You are stirring things, Vance said quietly. Alexander showed him the journal. Vance read in silence. When he finished, his hands were shaking. If this becomes public, Vance said, it will destroy reputations. Families, old names. It may also correct a lie, Alexander said. Vance met his eyes. Lies built this place. Truth nearly destroyed it once. Alexander answered calmly. Truth already destroyed it. Silence just hid the ruins. Vance warned him that there were men still alive whose fathers had ridden patrols that night in 1828. Men who would not welcome this story. Alexander thanked him and continued his work. That night the haunting intensified. He heard Latin whispered in the halls. Familiar phrases. Lines from Virgil, from Seneca. Mens libera, a free mind. Alexander followed the sound to the study. The journal lay open on the desk though he was sure he had closed it. The final page fluttered. The ink stain looked darker. He felt then that the house was not trying to frighten him. It was urging him forward. The next morning Alexander wrote letters to universities in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. He included copies of the journal. Names. Evidence. He sent them. The reaction was swift. Within weeks replies arrived. Shock. Skepticism. Awe. One professor wrote that if verified, this would change how scholars understood education under slavery. Another warned him that such a revelation would provoke anger. Alexander expected anger. What he did not expect was violence. One night the barn burned. The fire was small, controlled. A message. No animals harmed. No accident. Alexander stood watching the flames until they died. He did not leave. Days later a stone shattered a window. Attached was a note. Last warning. Alexander understood then that Willowbrook was not finished punishing those who spoke. But he also understood something else. Silence had already done enough damage. Alexander decided to stay. He invited scholars to visit. He opened the house. He shared the story. Some came. Others refused. The town grew colder. One evening, as Alexander read aloud from the journal to a visiting professor, the whispering returned. This time the professor heard it too. Latin. Clear. Measured. Voices layered together. 73 minds speaking as one. The professor fled the next morning. Alexander stayed. He carved another stone by the creek. Veritas non occiditur. Truth is not killed. In the next part, the story of Willowbrook will finally reach the public and the country will react in ways Alexander never expected. If this story has made you uneasy, subscribe to the channel, share it with others, and tell us in the comments what you think happens when a buried truth finally sees daylight. Because the most frightening ghosts are not the dead. They are the truths we refuse to face. Part 8. When the country listened. Some stories do not stay where they are told. They move outward like ripples in water, touching people who never expected to be involved. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel, share this story with someone who loves hidden history, and tell us in the comments if you believe the past ever truly stays buried. Now let us see what happened when Willowbrook was finally heard. The first article appeared quietly. A small academic journal published Alexander Hayes's research under a careful title, Education Networks Among the Enslaved in Early 19th Century Virginia. There was no mention of Willowbrook in the headline, but inside the article were names, dates, evidence, enough to disturb anyone who read closely. At first the reaction was slow. A few scholars wrote letters. Some praised the work, others questioned its authenticity. Then a professor at a northern university gave a public lecture. He spoke about secret lessons, about Latin texts memorized in candlelight, about a plantation where enslaved people had been taught to think freely. And he named Willowbrook. That was when the story escaped. Newspapers picked it up, then magazines, then traveling lecturers. The name Willowbrook Plantation appeared in print for the first time in decades. Alexander watched the headlines arrive by post. Some called it a revelation. Others called it a lie. A few called it dangerous. Visitors began arriving at the gates. Some came with curiosity, some with anger. One man spat at Alexander's feet and called him a traitor to his blood. Another wept quietly by the creek when he heard the names. The house reacted to the attention. At night the whispers grew louder. Not frantic, focused. It felt as though the voices were finally being heard. But not everyone wanted that. A group of local landowners petitioned the county to seize Willowbrook. They claimed it was unsafe, unstable, a public disturbance. Alexander received official notices. He was warned to leave. He refused. The more pressure came, the more evidence surfaced. A library in Massachusetts uncovered a notebook written by Marcus, the former student turned teacher. A church archive in Pennsylvania produced sermon notes quoting classical philosophy written in a careful, unfamiliar hand. A woman in Boston left a diary to her granddaughter mentioning lectures given by a woman named Diana who spoke like an ancient scholar. The network revealed itself piece by piece. The 73 were no longer shadows. They were teachers, writers, thinkers, and suddenly the country was arguing. Could enslaved people have learned this much? Could a plantation owner have allowed it? Was this history being exaggerated? Alexander answered every challenge with documents. The journal, the stones, the names. Then the threats returned. One night Alexander woke to the smell of smoke. The main house was untouched but the study window had been shattered again. Inside the broken glass lay a burned scrap of paper. Mens libera. Mockery. That same night Alexander heard footsteps moving fast through the halls. Not slow like before. Angry. The whispers rose into something louder. Overlapping voices filling every room. Alexander stood in the center of the house and spoke aloud. I am not stopping. The sound stopped instantly. The silence that followed was deep. Protective. The next morning soldiers arrived. Not to arrest Alexander. To guard him. A northern newspaper had sent reporters. They brought attention and attention brought protection. Willowbrook was no longer just a house. It was evidence. But history demands a price. One afternoon Alexander was confronted by a woman from Fairhaven. Her family name was listed in the journal among those who led the raid. She was shaking. My father told me they were dangerous, she said. That they were planning something violent. Alexander showed her the lessons. The translations. The philosophical discussions. No weapons. No plans. Just minds. She left without speaking. That night Alexander dreamed again of Thomas Hayes. This time his uncle spoke. You have done what I could not. When Alexander woke, the dream lingered like a blessing and a warning. The public reaction reached Congress. Debates were held. Speeches made. Some lawmakers used Willowbrook as proof that education threatened order. Others used it to argue that intelligence had always existed and had been deliberately crushed. Alexander realized then that the story had grown larger than truth. It had become a symbol. And symbols attract extremes. One evening a crowd gathered outside Willowbrook. Some carried lanterns. Others carried signs. They shouted, accused, demanded. Alexander stood at the doorway holding the journal. He did not shout back. He read the names. One by one, the crowd grew quiet. Some left. Others stayed, but no one crossed the threshold. That night the whispers softened. For the first time, Alexander felt peace inside the house. The truth was no longer trapped here. It had escaped, but something remained unfinished. Alexander knew it. The journal ended without closure. The 73 had been remembered. But the house itself still waited. In the next part, Alexander will uncover the final secret Willowbrook has kept, and it will change the meaning of everything that came before. If this story has moved you, subscribe to the channel, share it with others, and tell us in the comments how you think this story should end. Because some histories do not rest until they are fully told. Part 9. The lesson that never ended. Some secrets do not want to stay silent. They wait, they watch, and when the time is right, they demand to be finished. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel, share this story with someone who loves hidden history, and tell us in the comments what you think Willowbrook is still hiding. Now listen closely, because this part changes everything. After the crowd left Willowbrook that night, Alexander could not sleep. The house was quiet but not empty. The air felt thick, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. He returned to the study and placed the journal on the desk. For the first time since reading the last entry, he noticed something strange. The final pages were not torn or missing. They were blank. Dozens of empty pages followed the last dated entry. At first Alexander assumed his uncle had simply stopped writing. But then he noticed faint impressions on the paper. Indentations. As if words had once been written and then carefully erased. Alexander remembered something Marcus had written in his later notebook. Some lessons were never written down. They were passed mouth to ear. Mind to mind. He took a candle and angled the light across the page. Slowly, letters appeared. Not ink. Pressure. The words emerged line by line. Not Latin. English. April 1826. We have reached the end of what books can teach us. Alexander's hands began to shake. The entry continued. The students asked what comes after knowledge. What use is understanding if the world remains unchanged? I had no answer prepared. So I listened. Marcus spoke first. He said learning taught us what freedom feels like but not how to keep it. Diana said freedom begins when fear no longer controls thought. Benjamin said ideas survive longer than bodies. Alexander read on. They had decided to create something new. Not an escape plan. Not a rebellion. A continuation. A school that would outlive them. The entry described how the most advanced students were teaching others in nearby plantations. Quietly, patiently, without my guidance, my uncle wrote. The experiment has surpassed the teacher. Alexander sat back. This was never just one place. Willowbrook was a seed. The final hidden entry chilled him. If this journal is found, then I am gone. Perhaps dead, perhaps disappeared. But the lesson continues. Watch the students, not the house. That night Alexander dreamed again. But this time he was not alone in the house. He stood in the woods. Torches flickered between trees. Dozens of figures moved. Silently, teaching, whispering, passing knowledge forward. He woke with a certainty. The story was not finished because it was never meant to end. The next morning Alexander visited the old laundry house. He had avoided it until now. The building was collapsing, but inside he found carvings on the wall. Latin phrases, philosophical questions, names layered over names, some unfamiliar, later generations, proof that learning had continued long after the journal stopped. In the woods beyond the south field, he found stone markers. Not graves, meeting points, each marked with a symbol. An owl, a lamp, a book. The network had survived. For decades, possibly centuries. Alexander realized the horror was not the violence alone. It was the system that feared thinking so much it tried to erase it. And failed. The attention around Willowbrook shifted. People stopped asking if the story was true. They began asking how far it went. Schools requested copies of the journal. Teachers rewrote lesson plans. Students learned names they had never been taught before. Marcus, Diana, Benjamin, not as victims, as scholars. But danger returned. One evening Alexander received an anonymous letter. Stop digging or Willowbrook burns. That night the house trembled with whispers. Urgent. Protective. Alexander spoke again. I will finish it. The fear lifted. The house settled. Alexander knew what he had to do. He would make Willowbrook public. Not as a museum. As a school. A place where the lesson that began in secret would continue openly. The announcement caused outrage and support in equal measure. Donations arrived. Volunteers came. Historians argued. But construction began. During the first night of renovation, workers fled. They claimed voices corrected their reading aloud. That hands guided theirs when they carved words into stone. Alexander smiled. "They are helping," he said. The opening ceremony took place at dusk. Alexander read the final hidden entry aloud. When he finished, the wind moved through the trees. Soft, like applause. In the crowd stood a young girl holding a Latin textbook. She asked Alexander what it meant. "Mens libera," he answered. "A free mind." She smiled. In the next and final part, the truth of Willowbrook will face the future and the cost of remembering will be revealed. If this story has stayed with you, subscribe to the channel, share it with others, and tell us in the comments what freedom means to you. Because some lessons are meant to be carried forward forever. Part 10. The Legacy of Willowbrook. Some stories do not end. They evolve. They demand action. They leave questions burning long after the last word is read. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel, share this story with someone who loves hidden history, and tell us in the comments what you would do if you discovered a secret that could change everything you thought you knew about the past. Alexander Hayes stood at the edge of the main house one September morning, the wind moving softly through the tall tobacco fields. The air smelled of earth and wood and something older, something unspoken. He had spent weeks preparing Willowbrook for its rebirth, restoring not just the physical buildings but the story buried in every floorboard, every stone, every shadow. Inside, the study was quiet. The journal lay open on the desk, its pages carefully transcribed and preserved. Alexander traced the ink stains and indentations one last time. He had read every line, every name, every risk, every act of courage, and now he understood the full weight of what had been hidden here. The 73 names were not just names. They were a declaration, a rebellion not of weapons or fire, but of thought, of mind, of freedom that could not be chained. Outside the house, construction had begun on classrooms and meeting spaces. Scholars and volunteers had come from across the country. Some were still skeptical, some were angry, but all understood that Willowbrook was no longer just a plantation. It was a living testament to the power of knowledge. Alexander walked the halls of the house as the sun climbed higher, light spilling across the dusty floors. He imagined the students of Thomas Hayes, gathered in the tobacco barn after dark, candlelight flickering across determined faces, whispers of Latin rolling softly through the shadows. He imagined Diana correcting a translation, Marcus debating the meaning of virtue, Benjamin struggling through a conjugation but refusing to quit. He realized that Willowbrook had always been haunted, not by ghosts, but by courage, by ideas, by fear and hope coexisting in the same space. The first visitors of the day arrived at the front gates. They were students from a nearby school, children who had never been taught about the hidden histories of their own region. Alexander greeted them at the doorway. He could see their curiosity in wide eyes, their hesitation in careful steps. Inside, he told the story. Not in fragments, not as legend, as truth. He read from the journal, he showed the stones by the creek, he pointed to the carvings in the laundry house and the indentations in the pages of the final entries. They listened in silence. When he finished, a girl raised her hand. She was no older than 12. Her voice trembled. "Why did they risk everything just to learn Latin, sir?" Alexander smiled. It was the question he had asked himself more than once, standing here alone in the empty house. "Because learning is dangerous," he said. "Because it cannot be controlled. Because a free mind is the first step to freedom in every other way." The children nodded. Some scribbled notes. Others whispered questions to each other. Alexander walked away for a moment and gazed out the east-facing windows at the golden fields. For the first time in decades, Willowbrook did not feel like a place of shame or silence. It felt like it had always been meant to be a place of teaching. That night, Alexander returned to the study alone. He lit a candle and placed it on the desk, the flame flickering against the leather-bound journal. He read the last hidden entry once more. April 1826. The experiment has surpassed the teacher. Watch the students, not the house. Alexander realized that the experiment had never truly belonged to Thomas Hayes. It belonged to the 73, and now it belonged to everyone who carried their legacy forward. And then he heard it. A whisper. Soft, deliberate, almost a sigh. "Mens libera." Alexander closed his eyes. It was the same voice he had heard in his dreams, in the woods, in the walls of Willowbrook. And yet it was not a single voice. It was many, 73, perhaps more, calling from beyond the years. A chorus of minds that refused to be silenced. The next morning, the restoration of Willowbrook was complete. Classrooms were ready, libraries filled, stones polished, carvings preserved. Visitors arrived in groups, some skeptical, some reverent. Historians, journalists, students, and ordinary citizens came to see the plantation transformed. Alexander spoke to them all. He told them the story, carefully, fully, with the names of every student recorded in the journal and now in public memory. He explained that these were people who had been denied their rights, denied their freedom, but who refused to be denied their minds. The reaction was overwhelming. Letters came from across the country. Scholars offered to contribute texts. Students requested more lessons. Willowbrook became a center not only for history but for education, philosophy, and the preservation of forgotten knowledge. Alexander felt the weight lift from his shoulders. He had brought the story out of hiding. He had honored the courage of those who risked their lives to learn. And he had ensured that their legacy would continue. But Willowbrook still held its secrets. Alexander knew that not everything would be understood. Not everything would be recorded. Not every name would ever be known. And perhaps that was right. Some lessons belong to the mind alone. Some courage belongs to the silence. Standing in the study one last time, Alexander whispered to the journal. "Thank you." Outside, the wind moved through the trees. The stones by the creek caught the morning light. The names carved into wood and stone and memory shone quietly in the sun. Mens libera, a free mind. Alexander stepped outside and looked over the land. He understood now that Willowbrook was not a plantation. It was a promise. A proof that even in the darkest times, even in a society built on oppression, courage and learning could survive. And that promise would continue. If you have followed this story from the beginning, subscribe to the channel to uncover more hidden histories. Share this series with someone who loves mysteries from the past. And tell us in the comments which part of Willowbrook's story moved you the most and why. Because some lessons, some truths, and some courage are meant to be carried forward forever. The story of Willowbrook is over for now, but the legacy of 73 minds lives on. Mens libera, a free mind.